Welcome to this week's Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hahn. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here and the director of the Humanities Forum. We have a very special guest with us this week. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Scott Hahn here to campus for us this afternoon. Before we introduce him, I'd like to just remind you that our reception, which is usually in the great room, is across the hall today, and I'll mention it again at the end, just so we all end up in the same place to continue the conversation. For the moment, please welcome Dr. Darius Bazzano from the Theology Department, who will introduce our guests this afternoon.
Thank you. It's a real honor for me today to introduce Dr. Scott Hahn. He's the author or editor of over 40 books, approaching 50 by now, I'm sure, including best-selling titles like Rome, Sweet Home, The Lamb's Supper, and Hail, Holy Queen. His most recent titles include The First Society on Christian Marriage, Romans, a Catholic Commentary, and The Creed, Evangelizing Catholics, and Joy to the World. Academic publications include Kinship by Covenant and Politicizing the Bible. He's also the editor of an academic journal, Letter and Spirit, a journal of Catholic Biblical Theology. Dr. Hahn holds the Father Michael Scanlan Chair of Biblical Theology and New Evangelization at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, where he's taught since 1990. He's the founder and president of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. Dr. Hahn has the rare gift of being able to engage both popular and academic audiences and has delivered thousands of popular talks and lectures, nationally and internationally, on a wide range of topics related to Scripture, theology, and the Catholic faith. And if you're interested in finding any of these or any of his books, they're available outside in the hall. Many of them have been recorded and distributed by Lighthouse Catholic Media. Dr. Hahn received his MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in 1982 and his PhD in theology from Marquette University in 1995. He was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1982 at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Fairfax, Virginia, and entered the Catholic Church at the Easter Vigil in 1986. Dr. Hahn has been married to his wife, Kimberly, for 38 years. They live in Steubenville, Ohio, where it snows like this all the time, and have 6 children and 15 grandchildren. And Dr. Hahn doesn't know this, but his talks have been important in my own theological and spiritual journey. And every semester I show a YouTube clip of him talking about the Mass in my class on Catholic liturgy. So I invite you to enthusiastically welcome Dr. Hahn, who will be speaking today on how does the new evangelization fit with Catholic education. Dr. Scott Hahn.
Daria, thank you for that introduction. It's really a privilege for me to be here at Providence College, to be invited to partake of this fellowship here, the forum. And I want to admit from the outset, before we really get started, I had a 25-page paper written, and I have it here to read. I just attended a public lecture 2 weeks ago on our campus, and the lecturer read his 24-page paper. Some of us stayed awake, but most of us didn't, and so I made a resolution to make some adjustments and do this a slightly different way. It's available in a new book that came out, Fidelity and Freedom, Ex Cordia Ecclesia 25. It was a paper that I originally wrote back, 3 years ago in 2015, when we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of Ex Cordia Ecclesia. It just came out in published form last year. But I'm already revising the paper and adapting it into well, I hope it's a bookling. I don't want it to be terribly long, but I'm working with the same outline. So those of you who have had a chance to look at the paper, I'm not going to be deviating in any significant way, but I do want to present it in more of an oral style, semi-academic and semi-popular. I'd like to begin by asking the question whether the new evangelization really fits with Catholic higher education, sort of echoing what we're familiar with in terms of the quaestio. It would appear that the new evangelization does not pertain to Catholic higher education. Why? Well, for one thing, the very nature of evangelization, as distinct from the nature and purpose of Catholic colleges and universities, evangelization involves addressing the intellect but reaching the will for the purpose of initial conversion. Whereas higher education involves the rigorous formation of the intellect. Furthermore, the nature of conversion is a free act, which cannot be induced by classroom presentations or grades. And so it doesn't seem fitting for conversion to be something sought after in an institution of Catholic higher learning. Thirdly, the very purpose of the university has more to do with the intellect, more to do with culture, professional preparation, and such things. And I could go on about my understanding of the university drawn from the great Newman's work, Idea of the University, and also I'd recommend Benedict Ashley's work on this subject. But sort of the sed contra, let me just state from the outset that, in fact, from the perspective of our tradition, the new evangelization does, in fact, have a place in Catholic higher education. In his first published encyclical, Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, Article 134, states, universities are outstanding environments for articulating and developing this evangelizing commitment in an interdisciplinary and integrated way. Catholic schools, which always strive to join their work of education with the explicit proclamation of the gospel, are a most valuable resource for the evangelization of culture. So notice the shift, that we're not talking simply about the initial evangelization of persons. We're not talking simply about the initial conversion of someone who accepts Jesus as Savior and Lord, that sort of thing. No, what we have to do is clarify what we mean by evangelization, how we understand conversion, and what in fact the meaning of the new evangelization is, in order to see how it does in fact fit with a Catholic college or university. And what Pope Francis was writing there in Evangelii Gaudium was not something odd. In fact, he was synthesizing proposition number 27, the longest of the 58 propositions that were given as the instrumentum laboris in preparation for the October 2012 Synod on the new evangelization. I'm not going to read all of proposition 27 because, as I said, it is the longest of the 58. But what we hear are the following points. First, education is a constitutive dimension of evangelization. So there is no tension. Second, education needs at the same time to promote everything that is true, good, and beautiful, that is a part of the human person, to educate the mind and the emotions to appreciate reality. So it isn't exclusively intellectualist, it also reaches the will and the emotions. Third, Catholic universities respond in this way to this need. Fourth, this encourages Catholic educational institutions to do all that is possible to preserve their identity as ecclesial institutions. I think it's important just to stop for a moment and remind ourselves that just as the church is not reducible to the clergy, so likewise, we don't want to reduce the ecclesial work of evangelization simply to parishes. And so we can see that, in fact, lay people as well as clergy form the sacramental organism that we know as the church. Fifth and finally, Proposition 27 states, the church invites all teachers to embrace the leadership which is theirs as baptized disciples of Jesus, giving witness through their vocation as educators. Now, these propositions also fit with the general outline and flow of my presentation. But let me be clear from the outset. What I'd like to do is to argue toward a conclusion that might strike us all as somewhat counterintuitive. Not only would I say that the new evangelization fits with the college or university, Catholic higher education in general. In fact, I would go so far as to say there may not be any institution better suited then the Catholic university or college to advance the new evangelization once we understand specifically and properly what we mean by the new evangelization. So let me take a step back and look at what has happened in the last half century with the language of the new evangelization, because as the late great Cardinal Dulles points out, this goes all the way back to Vatican II. Now, some people posit a hermeneutic of rupture and discontinuity between Vatican I and Vatican II, or Vatican II and everything that came before it. But in fact, it really is the same faith, but there is an aggiornamento, an updating that was greatly needed. But when you compare the documents of Vatican I to the documents of Vatican II, you find the same mystery of faith, expounded in slightly different terms, perhaps more biblical, more pastoral, more personalistic. But there is one thing that does stand out in stark contrast. The Latin term evangelium occurs once in the documents of Vatican I. However, the variations on evangelium, to evangelize, evangelizing, evangelization, these terms occur in the documents of Vatican II 206 times, if my count be accurate. And when John the 23rd died and was succeeded by Cardinal Montini, who took the name Pope Paul VI, in his first press conference, when they asked him why he took Paul as his name, since there hadn't been a pope named Paul for more than 3 centuries, he explained that it was his purpose to become an apostle and an evangelizer. And so he became the first pope in history to make apostolic journeys to other continents, which commenced even before Vatican II was over. So he went to the Holy Land in 64, and he explained he went not just as a pilgrim, but as an evangelizer. Then on to India. And then the next year in 65, shortly before the end of Vatican II in December, he came to New York City and addressed the United Nations. And his stated purpose was to proclaim the gospel in its fullness. On to Portugal and Turkey in 66 and 67, Colombia in 68, to Uganda in 69. And then in 1970, this was the banner year for his evangelistic travels: Iran, East Pakistan, the Philippines, West Samoa, Australia, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and Sri Lanka. Just parenthetically, we only found out at the beatification of Pope Paul VI that there actually was an assassination attempt on his life when he landed in Manila. When they pulled out this old grade, this blood-stained tunic, he had been stabbed twice, and before they could the would-be assassin could plunge the dagger, and a third time he was tackled to the ground, and they took Paul VI off and treated him and strongly advised him not to continue. He insisted upon completing this evangelistic mission that he had for the Philippines. Now, all of these exploits are practically forgotten because of the unprecedented degree of travel by his successor, now Pope St. John Paul II. Before I look at John Paul and how he coined the terminology of new evangelization, I might also add that when he was too old to travel in the early 70s, he was not too old to emphasize the need to evangelize, and so he convened the Synod of Bishops in Rome in 1974 and ended up publishing what many consider to be his most influential document, Evangelii Nuntiandi, on evangelization in the modern world the next year in 75. He's very straightforward when he states his thesis. I quote, "The basic duty of the church is to evangelize. Evangelization is in fact the grace and vocation most proper to the church, her true and deepest identity. She exists in order to evangelize, to be the channel of the gift of grace, to reconcile sinners with God, and to perpetuate Christ's sacrifice in the Mass, which is the memorial of his death and glorious resurrection." And again, I will note just parenthetically how interesting it is that he doesn't separate at all the task of evangelization from the liturgical celebration of the mystery of the Eucharist, something I hope we can come back to in the Q&A after this presentation. But as much as Paul VI stressed evangelization and did his work to evangelize, it was John Paul II who really took it to the next level. Over 125 countries he traveled to, clocking in well over 1 million kilometers. We couldn't begin to enumerate all of the countries and places he went to. He picked up right on the theme of evangelization, but in his very first year, when he returned to his homeland of Poland, he coined the phrase, the new evangelization. Apparently, it wasn't in the script. The homily that had been prepared didn't have it, but he deviated from the script when he looked out at the sea of his fellow Polish countrymen and noticed the ravages of secularization, of the Nazis, of the Soviets. And so he emphasized the need there at Nowa Huta, this foundry, this industrial city that had been built by the Soviets as a kind of workers' paradise. And he emphasized, it was the only city in Poland that for the first generation or so didn't allow any Catholic parish to be built until this young Bishop Wojtyła pressured them to allow one to be built. And that's when he returned to Nowa Huta. New steelworks is what it means in Poland. And not only expressed the need for the new evangelization, but explained the meaning. That it's not new because the church had stopped evangelizing, it's new because of the need to re-evangelize the de-Christianized. And so this was a theme that he inserted into this presentation. He didn't use the phrase "from all my research" for another 4 years. It wasn't until he came back to America and was addressing bishops in North, Central, and South America in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And that's when he not only used it a second time, but a third and a 10th time, and he began to use it then hundreds and hundreds of times. And once again, he clarified what the new evangelization means by explaining that it is to re-evangelize the de-Christianized. He looked out and saw the effects of consumerism and materialism. It wasn't just the Nazis and the Soviet communists. And playfully, he challenged the bishops of the Americas to launch it in 1992, 9 years later. When he was asked in a press conference why the delay, he smiled and he said, because that will commemorate the 500th anniversary of the founding and the first evangelizing of the Americas. So when you go back to 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the most populous Catholic countries in the world back then were, of course, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and France. But when you fast forward 5 centuries, in the 1990s, they are Brazil in first place, Mexico in second place, and the US coming in third. And so seeing the influence of the Americas on the rest of the world and recognizing the decline in certain quarters of the Americas of the faith, he was basically implying, where will you be? Not only 5 centuries, but now but in a few generations as well. So as 1992 approached, he published in 1990 2 very important documents. One, of course, was Redemptoris Missio, the mission of the Redeemer, which has been nicknamed the Magna Carta of the new evangelization, because that's practically what the entire document is about. And just as plainly as Pope Paul VI had explained his thesis and purpose, so likewise John Paul does it here. He says, and I quote, "The moment has come to commit all of the church's energies to the new evangelization. No believer in Christ, no institution of the church can avoid this supreme duty to proclaim Christ to all peoples." Around the same time, he published Ex Corde Ecclesia, which seems to be an entirely different document for an entirely different purpose, except that from the heart of the church describes the purpose and mission of the Catholic University. And the fact that they both were published in 1990 may not be entirely accidental. In fact, the 2 documents, I believe, are mutually illuminating as well as mutually reinforcing. You may recall, if you're old enough, that he also shocked the world back in the early 90s by announcing that the next World Youth Day would be held where? In Denver, Colorado in 93. Even his closest advisors strongly encouraged him to rethink the matter because the previous World Youth Days had been such smashing successes because, they told the Pope, they had been held in countries that were predominantly Catholic, where the tradition of pilgrimage was still quite common and popular among the young. And so previous World Youth Days in Buenos Aires, Santiago de Compostela, Czestochowa, and Rome had gathered hundreds of thousands, in fact millions. And so they predicted the bleak turnout for Denver. But then, of course, in August of 1993, when World Youth Day rolled around, all of the journalists later admitted crumbling up their rough drafts. They had written pre-drafts of the abysmal turnout and the apparent failure. And then, of course, when the Pope's helicopter was circling over Cherry Creek Park it appeared to be buffeted not by winds, but by the force of all of the applause and the cheers and the shouts of not quite 1 million young people who had gathered 10 times what they were expecting or predicting. So at that point, the new evangelization was in full swing. And most of us assumed back then that the 1990s was, in fact, the decade of the new evangelization. I have lost count, but over 10 people referred to that decade in those terms, that decade of the new evangelization. I think we all assumed that was John Paul's intention, but when you go back to the documents, what you find is that he referred to the decade of the 90s as preparation. He also called it the Advent season of the new evangelization, clearly employing a familiar liturgical analogy. Because when Advent is over, 4 Sundays in December typically, what remains, well, 48 more Sundays are still to follow. And so when the decade of the 90s was done, the new evangelization was over, it had barely begun. And very few people recognize that fact. One fellow who did was then the cardinal prefect of the CDF, and when he was named Pope Benedict in 2005, he wasted little time informing the congregation for promoting the new evangelization, not only for the purpose of establishing it in every diocese and parish, but also very clearly in every Catholic college and university as well. He was just as explicit as John Paul as to the importance of the new evangelization for Catholic higher education. And in the paper, I'm not going to bother going through all of the quotes, but there are a number of them that indicate this. That same year, 2005, you might recall that the Vatican published a new compendium, over 1,000 pages, the Compendium for the Social Doctrine of the Church. And in this, another connection was made between higher education on the one hand and the new evangelization, but the midpoint, the meeting ground, would be, in fact, the social doctrine. And I quote now from Article 64 of the compendium. The supernatural is not to be understood as an entity or a place that begins where the natural leaves off, but as the raising of the natural to a higher plane. Nothing of the created order of the human order is foreign to or excluded from the supernatural order of faith and grace. Rather, it is found within it, taken on, and elevated by it. We're familiar with the scholastic axiom that nature doesn't, what? Destroy grace. Grace doesn't destroy nature, it presupposes, it builds upon it. For what purpose? To heal, to perfect, but also to elevate. And that's the point that's emphasized here. Grace is elevating nature. So the whole person, but also persons and societies, must become engaged with the salvific economy of the gospel. And the church's social doctrine in particular is an essential and integral part of the church's evangelizing ministry. Nothing that concerns the community of men and women, justice, freedom, development, relations between peoples, peace, is foreign to the new evangelization, and indeed evangelization would be incomplete if it did not take into account the mutual demands continually made by the gospel for the concrete personal, social, economic, and political life of human persons. And again, there are a number of other passages in the compendium that I cite, but I'm going to stop there. What I want to do now is emphasize what we mean not only by the new evangelization, but a distinctive Catholic understanding of the theology of conversion. Because I think a lot of times we assume that evangelization is reducible to hearing the gospel for the first time, making a decision, having an experience, and becoming a convert. And way back in the 90s, Cardinal Dulles spent the last 10 years of his life writing a series of articles on the new evangelization. And he addressed this issue. Why are Catholics in America particularly wary of evangelization? He cites several reasons. They see it as the chosen trademark of revivalist and fundamentalist sects, some of them virulently anti-Catholic. They distrust the biblicism, the individualism, the emotionalism, and the aggressive proselytism of certain Protestant evangelistic preachers. Many are repelled by recent revelations about the financial dealings and private lives of several prominent televangelists. Besides, he says, in America, we have a tradition that religion is a purely private matter and most Catholics prefer to keep it that way. But then he goes on to say this, I submit that the popes of this time have correctly identified God's call to the church for our day and may have hit upon the most effective remedy for the church's present ills. The church has become too introverted. If Catholics today are sometimes weak in their faith, this is partly because of their reluctance to share it. But once we study the faith and grow in our understanding of its universal dimensions, once we grasp the universal validity of the message and its significance for the entire human race and every aspect of human life, we gain a new appreciation of the privilege of being the bearers of this gospel. As John Paul asserts, faith is only strengthened when it's given to others. You can't keep the faith if you're not willing to share it. So evangelization involves more than just what we used to call the 4 spiritual laws. God loves you, you've sinned, Christ died for that, and so now you've got to choose what to do. You go back to the old evangelization in the first 4 or 5 centuries of the early church, and you're going to see that that was initial evangelization, the kerygma, the core, and it produced initial conversion. But in our tradition, conversion is not over and done, a thing in the past, once and for all. Conversion in the ancient church was understood as something ongoing, something ever deepening. In fact, they understood it in terms of the gospel as lifelong. As Jesus tells the disciples, if anyone would follow me, he must take up his cross every day and follow me. That is not something that starts to become easy or starts to be pleasurable. Taking up the cross is what requires for Augustine a grace of ongoing conversion, so that he testified to the fact that he needed grace even more as he got older in his life. So the Catechism states it well in paragraph 1229, for becoming a Christian is accomplished as a journey in several stages in which certain essential elements need to be present. They identify the kerygma, the core of the gospel, the proclamation of the word, acceptance of the gospel, but that entails initial conversion. And then subsequently, the practice of prayer must be learned, along with the profession of faith. And what's described there, of course, is what we would call the catechumenate. When you move from convert status to catechumen, when you move from the initial conversion to the commitment of faith, whereby you are prepared for what we just celebrated earlier this week, and that is Easter, the vigil. And so the paragraph concludes that a climax is achieved with baptism, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, alluding to confirmation, and admission to Eucharist as well. So the sacraments of initiation show that, in fact, conversion hasn't ended, because becoming a Christian is a journey that takes your entire life. And so infant baptism, but also adult baptism, calls for a post-baptismal catechumenate. Cyril of Jerusalem, of course, refers to this in his mystagogical catechesis. And there are a number of references in the article and in the book that I'm preparing that go into this as well. But it's not just evangelistic, it's not just catechetical, it's not just mystagogical. There's something more that is involved in the church's witness that pertains to the Catholic university or college. And what I'd like to focus on now for a moment is what in fact we mean by education, what in fact takes place in Catholic institutions of higher learning. Just as conversion is not just something initial, but ongoing, just as it's not just interior but exterior, not just personal but interpersonal and social, not just private but public. So likewise, it is something sacred, but it also sanctifies the temporal order, as we hear in Apostolicam Actuositatem throughout Vatican II, other documents as well. So it's not just about theology and catechetics, it's about politics, economics, the social life, as the Church's social doctrine emphasizes. It's not just about the confession of faith that we learn as catechumens, it's about our professional life as well. So it's what's happening when professors do more than just give lectures, tests, and grades. It's when they mentor. It's when they serve as role models. And I don't know about you, but when I look back on my own life as an undergraduate in college, I look to friendships that were formed in classes that I took with professors who taught us, and some were better and others weren't as good, but the ones who were in some ways the most influential upon my own formation were the ones who did more than teach, more than test, and more than grade. This sort of mentoring, we could call it discipleship if we trace disciple back to mathetes, because the Greek term for disciple emphasizes disciplined learning more than just religious fervor. And so we could say that the Catholic College or University is certainly not an evangelistic association. It's not a parish. And so its principal function is not what we would call evangelization. But once we broaden and deepen our understanding of evangelization, once we understand conversion as something so much more than that initial psychological response or movement of the will, then we can see why it is not just theology but biology, not just catechesis and philosophy but sociology, chemistry, medicine, law, politics, literature, the arts, the languages, every discipline that touches upon every area of human life. So it's not just for the clergy or the religious, it's for the laity especially. It's not just in ministry of the parish, it is also in the classroom, the university. It's not just to promote prayer, but vigorous study. It's not just academic, it's apostolic. And so that's why it's not just in the classroom, but in office hours. When you see your professors at Mass, when you see them at the supermarket, when you see them on the sidewalk with their families, or with friends and colleagues. And so for me, I think the key is to understand what I learned from John Henry Newman a long time ago when he was still at Oxford University, giving sermons in his Anglican days. One of my favorite of his university sermons is number 5, that he gave in 1821 to students who were there at Oxford. It was entitled, Personal Influence, the Means of Propagating the Truth. And in this homily, he reflects upon the fact that throughout the centuries, the church has confronted many obstacles, not only externally, but also internally as well. The church has grown and prospered often in spite of the weaknesses of her members, he says. This miraculous growth can be attributed to what he calls the influence of truth in the world at large, which arises mostly from the personal influence of those who are commissioned to teach it. And it concludes by saying the truth has been upheld in the world not as a system, not by books, not by argument, nor by temporal power, but by the personal influence of human persons who are at once the teachers, but also the patterns of truth that they teach. So I look back in my college days, seminary, and doctoral studies, and I see the men and women who taught me, but who lived out what they taught before my eyes, and not just in the office hours, but in their own lives as colleagues, as family members. And I am convinced that this also touches an essential part of why it is the new evangelization can not only find a place in institutions of Catholic higher learning, but why again, in fact, that there may not be any institution in the Catholic Church better suited for promoting this integral understanding of the new evangelization to bring about an integral experience of conversion that is lifelong, that is ever deepening, that in fact is transformative and not simply informative. So the idea that we have teachers, instructors, professors, but what we find in them are so often role models, mentors. We end up going off to the graduate schools that they recommend, not only because of the glowing letters of recommendation that they write, but because we want to continue the legacy that they have already begun to inspire within us. And so education becomes formation. Students become scholars. We move from the confession of faith as children to the professional life that we achieve. We're not just called to be students, not even scholars, we're called to be saints. And for that purpose, the formation of the truth, the beauty of the love of God that touches both will and intellect, both body and soul, both personal lives and interpersonal commitments, this is what makes me convinced that, in fact, there is no institution better suited in the church today than Catholic higher education, colleges and universities, to foster the new evangelization and to bring about its flourishing. Now, I want to begin to wrap up because the thing that I look forward to the most when I was anticipating my trip here to Providence was, in fact, the the Q&A, the give and take, the questions that you might have, the pushback that you might want to give. But I want to conclude by talking about what difference this makes, because I would really set forth not only the intellectual component of academic rigor that is essential for true Catholic higher education. I would say also that the primary apostolate is one of friendship. Friendships that are formed between professors and students. Friendships that students can see between colleagues as well. The mentoring that takes place. The Eucharist that we celebrate. The worldview that we enter through the sacraments. And so much more. I think especially of a Jesuit who took a sabbatical at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, much to the chagrin of his fellow confreres. Father Norrie Clarke was one of the great philosophers of the previous generation, teaching for decades at Fordham and Georgetown. If you ever look up the writings of Father Norrie Clarke, you will find a gold mine. He shocked his Jesuit confreres at Fordham by letting them know that he would take his sabbatical at this institution in Ohio which had invited him. So he spent a semester in Steubenville, Ohio, the least likely place on the planet for Norrie Clarke to be. I got to be his chauffeur on a number of occasions when I drove him back and forth to the Wheeling Jesuit residence, which was almost 40 minutes away. And at first he was somewhat surprised by what he experienced, because he said, candidly, the ACT and SAT scores, I suspect, of the students here can't match what I had at Georgetown and probably Fordham. But he said the intellectual appetite, the academic capacity, the longing for truth, he said, is just as ravenous here as anything I found elsewhere. And he told me one day when I was driving him back, he said, I think I have found the key that really solves the puzzle. I'm like, what is it, Father Norrie? He said, I went to noon mass and I saw practically all of my students. The place was packed and I could see them singing and listening and praying. And I realized that it was through the Eucharist that their souls were opened, their intellects were awakened, their will to learn more. He went on and on for 5 or 10 minutes describing what a difference the Eucharistic worship makes for Catholic intellectual formation. It took me a couple of minutes to recover. It was the least likely thing I expected from Father Clarke, but one of the most illuminating exchanges I've ever had. I would also say that there have been other experiences too. The worldview that flows from the Eucharist that binds us together as sons and daughters of God, as sisters and brothers in Christ, this implies a worldview that is simply almost too good to be true, except it's the truth that we enter every time. I remember a Dominican friend in Cambridge, Father Aidan Nichols, inviting me to Blackfriars to join with him. Apparently the Oxford Communio Catholics were going to have 2 days with the Cambridge Radical Orthodoxy Anglicans, and he wanted at least one other Thomist besides himself to be there. And so when I got there, we listened to Catherine Pickstock and present a summary of her book after writing, which was subtitled The Liturgical Consummation of Philosophy. And what she described was the epistemological developments of Western history to show how the epistemological heights were achieved in the high Middle Ages, where people actually believed that they could know the inner life of God, that they could unite themselves to the three persons of the eternal Godhead, that through the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the Roman Rite points to the very heart of God and gives meaning to human experience. And so this experience among academics of the Eucharist convinced me, if not Father Aidan, that in fact friendship at the natural level is raised up and elevated, perfected through our own Eucharistic communio. Father Jenkins from Notre Dame came to our university and gave a talk on Ex Corde a while back, and he had a similar explanation. He said, what happens that is all good there at Notre Dame and other schools has less to do with the academic programs and more with the presence of Christ and our celebration as a community of the Eucharist. I could go on. I wanted to conclude with a quotation that I can't seem to find here. This is what I just found last night that I'm going to be putting in the book, but I will find it short enough when we get back. It's a quotation from Father Hesburgh from back in 1962, published in America magazine, where I'll just try to paraphrase. He identifies the two biggest challenges that face Catholic institutions of higher learning. One is the pluralism of a secular society that isn't so much pluralistic, he said, as it is secularistic. And what we need to do more than ever before as Catholic institutions of higher learning, he said, is to bear witness to the mystery of faith, which alone can unite all of these seemingly disparate aspects of reality. And then he went on to identify this second problem that stems from the first, that really calling these places universities is almost a misnomer, because what we really are looking at would be more aptly described as a multiversity, because there really isn't any unity that we experience in a cosmic or universal way. And so this again represents the core challenge for Catholic colleges and universities to advance the church's mission in a way that parishes and priests can't, by conducting an apostolate of friendship, academic rigor, and at the same time uniting clergy and laity at places like this for the purpose of taking people into a grace of conversion that is ongoing and lifelong. Thank you very much.
We have about a half hour for discussion.
Good. All right.
If you would, wait for me to bring the microphone to you so that we can be sure to record your question. And as always, we'd like to begin with a question from a student.
Thank you, Dr. Hahn, for speaking. What you said, that quote you had towards the end, I think was especially pertinent when you said that one of the big issues for academia, for Catholic academia, is sort of rampant secularization. And it seems to me that Catholic universities have to sort of have like a one foot in like two different worlds. They have to meet certain academic standards which have to be sort of universally agreed upon by both religious and secular institutions, but yet they're also supposed to be, as you said, places of evangelization. And so how do Catholic universities, because this is not something you see in secular universities, so how do Catholics create that balance between that dual identity without giving up one or the other? So how can we, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but how do you, again, reconcile them and maintain and promote both in a way that's mutually implicative?
Right, good question. I'm not sure I can give an answer to that without giving another lecture, because that really is the $64,000 question. But I think, at one level, the aspect of academic rigor is crucial. And at the same time, a radical openness to learning from everywhere, anybody. And an engagement with the culture, and not just with the parts of the culture that we prefer or affirm. I also think that, I'm reminded of an exchange that we had back in the 90s when Rocco Buttiglione came to our campus. He had just helped John Paul write, I want to say Laborum Exercens, but actually it was Centissimus, I think. And Buttiglione was asked by some students, what can we do to really further this intellectual apostolate that you're identifying as our academic vocation? Because we're facing relativism, we're facing postmodernism, we're facing, all kinds of isms. And he said, what I would encourage you to do is don't just study them, forge friendships with Marxists, postmodernists, deconstructionists, radical feminists. And he even referred to the gay and lesbians. He said, form friendships with them and allow yourself to feel the force of their worldview, their argument. Even if it's unconvincing, even if it seems incoherent, for the sake of friendship, enter into their thoughts, into their world. Then you're not just refuting a position. Then you're engaging a friend. And through that friendship, then you can carry on an intellectual apostolate that isn't out just simply to prove you're right and they're wrong, but to build bridges and to tear down the walls. And that has come back to me hundreds of times in the last almost 20 years, 25 years, because I do believe that represents a significant part of the challenge especially as we grow more secularized, which really means more polarized and more unwilling to really engage one another. You know, this is why playfully I begin with a kind of questio method, because I think what Thomas does is to show us how to speak the truth in love. Always identify a position that everyone might know in advance represents your opponent's position, but then state it fairly, and then defend it persuasively, and lay out the arguments as fairly as you can, and then engage them. Don't write them off, but really look at them clearly, treat them forcefully, you know, and I think this this approach represents rules of engagement for the classroom. It's what I try to tell my students, both grad and undergrad, for their papers as well. I have learned far more from people I disagree with than I learn from the people I agree with. I also tell them that I never read the kinds of books that I write, and I never write the kinds of books that I read, or seldom. That you should really go deeply into things that are going to challenge you, not only in terms of your own moral convictions, but also intellectually because of the rigor that's involved. And I would say, to the extent that you can do that with the help and guidance of professors, not those who are going to tell you what to think or how to refute, but really show by role modeling how to engage with respect and fairness. In the last 28 years, we've had, I think, 52 or 53 mostly graduate students live with my family. I usually invite the students that I see having that kind of intellectual appetite, but also a kind of apostolic openness to others. And over the course of the years, I have found that this, you know, not only have my 6 kids look to them as older siblings, but I mean, the first one we invited was a fellow named Tim Gray, who was on a tennis scholarship, and he lived with us for 2 years. And we just watched him. He's now, I think, the founder and the president of the Augustine Institute out in Denver. And Ted Sri was the next fellow who lived with us. And Jade, who worked with the USCCB for the last 10 years or more. But I mean, the friendships, the professional bonds, I would help them build their libraries as well. I find that, when you encourage professors to engage you, and when professors encourage you to engage positions other than your own, that's when you really have not only an understanding of other positions, but also an appreciation for them if you can forge those bonds of friendship. I don't know if that even approximates an answer, but that's what came to my mind. Jim.
Hi. I'm trying to figure out what to say here. I liked your talk. It seems right to me. I'm not sure what the topic would be as far as Catholic higher education, because it seems that most of what you have said, and I think this is actually appropriate, and I'll say why in a second, would be geared for Catholic students and Catholic professors at any school.
That's right.
Okay. And I think that's kind of right, and I'm going to say why. I think we have to get used to, with some exceptions, Steubenville being one of them, to speak about Catholic colleges and universities as we do Catholic hospitals, which means Catholic by legacy primarily. And I don't mean that as a counsel of despair, but I think 25 or now 26 or 27 years after Ex Corde, I think, and James Burchell's Dying of the Light, I think it's essential for people who have been studying this to be as honest as they possibly can be, right? In my opinion, and I've had this for a long time, where there's a will on the part of the administrators, those who run the institutions, for an institution of higher learning to be Catholic, there's a way. Where there's not a will, there's not a way, right? And if you begin to think in terms of the number of Catholic, legacy institutions of higher education, where the administrators want to have a Catholic school, and what I mean by Catholic school is your typical student traveling through that degree program, whatever it may be, runs into, on a fairly regular basis, a professor who integrates faith and reason. If Catholic colleges, and the adjective Catholic does not mean that when applied to colleges and universities. It can't mean anything other than it used to be Catholic. And so I'm trying to get a sense of, because it seems to me what you are saying does apply to Catholic students and professors which I think is the case with 90% of the 260 odd colleges and universities that were established as Catholic places, where there is not any real will on the part, and there hasn't been any significant movement since Ex Corde. So people like me are always looking for a new strategy in light of the reality. And I'm wondering whether I know you're at Steubenville where there's a lot of will and a lot of way, okay? Right. But most of us are not at schools that are that way. The vast majority of us are not. And so is this approach of yours an attempt to reach out to those Catholic professors and Catholic students to give them a way to do the new evangelization within a college context? Because if it's the notion that the colleges of the United States are participants in any significant way as institutions in the new evangelization, that sounds like a fantasy to me and quite removed from reality. So I'm curious, I mean, that's a bit of a speech, but how would you respond to that? Because I'm always looking for a new strategy. I think you may have one with the new evangelization. It's a recognition, however, that the hopes and dreams of John Paul II and Ex Corde, we're going to have to recognize exactly what has come of that,
Right.
and think of something new.
Right. Okay. I appreciated your remarks, and I think I know the question, but check me if I don't. The question is sort of, what do we do with the situation we have now? You used the analogy early on of the hospitals. Yeah. And that seemed to me to be sort of the best example, because most Catholic hospitals are Catholic by legacy, and so they've had to accommodate all kinds of things that have been pressured down, on them. Before I even address the other thing, I should point out, coming from what I affectionately refer to as Planet Steubenville, I love the place. I've been there 28 years. We've got our sixth son, our sixth child going through it now. And my oldest is getting ready to defend a doctorate at Notre Dame in theology, and so there is an element of rigor that I have seen and have worked to apply on them and others too. But it is helpful to remember that, in '73, the board there at the College of Steubenville voted to declare bankruptcy. And so the president who came on had a gift, but nobody knew what it was. And he didn't either. I know him very close. I hold the Father Michael Scanlan chair. He had no illusions. He was from Harvard. He just came and, did a lot of things that proved to be right that he could end up taking credit for. But I mean, he was just walking in the storm. He had no idea. But I remember him convincing me that it wasn't about the charismatic renewal. It wasn't about orthodoxy. It really was about what Newman said, and that is personal influence, or what I like to call the apostolate of friendship. And I remember especially the Marxist professor who got the referendum to pass the vote of no confidence that failed by one vote for Scanlan to leave. He left, the Marxist left within 2 years, and went up to New York City, and as the story goes, was, I think, an associate editor for the Daily Worker. And so everybody on the faculty who was the old guard when I came talked about the war between the two. But what nobody knew until the fella died was that Father Mike stayed in touch with him. They were on the phone. He would fly up secretly. They would have clandestine visits until, through friendship and countless dinners, he heard his confession. He came back into the church. And then he could finally tell the story after the funeral. But to me, that's the bottom line. It really is friendship. It's taking seriously not only your commitment to the Catholic faith and loyalty to the magisterium, but also a willingness to accept people the way they are, because that's how our Lord accepts me. And so I think that can be done, as you implied, anywhere. It doesn't have to be a Catholic college or a university. I think the fifth person who lived with me for a year, not quite a year, was Curtis Martin doing his graduate studies, and I challenged him to develop something for secular campuses. And so I came up with an acronym that he applied called the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. And so focuses on over 100 campuses. It isn't the cure-all. It isn't like one size fits all in any instance. But what he was convinced of was that it's so easy when you're living on an oasis like Steubenville. But what really matters is if you can reach people, not only on secular campuses spiritually, but you can awaken in them the intellect, the desire to pursue professional excellence in whatever academic field they're in. And I would be the first to say that we have a lot of room to grow in that area. At Steubenville, folk everywhere else for that matter. But I do think the mutual encouragement of one another between professor and student, but also mentoring and I should say collegiality. I am convinced that that matters more than everything else put together. That if we get laws changed, if we get new board members, but if we're still pricks, it's not going to work. I find that complaining, criticizing, that is the thing I am most tempted to do, but I find that that is the one thing that hardly ever accomplishes anything good. Before, I wanted to ask James, can you respond? Because you should see him. I mean, standing up here, he's sitting there like, well, I would say this and I would say that. And I want to know what you're going to say. Okay.
I actually agree with you. I think that the era of complaint, I was trying to communicate that. I think it's over.
Yeah.
I think it's over because the reality is set in. Again, I don't mean that as a counsel of disparity. I mean it's the truth. So what does one do? Well, one can continue to fight a battle, which I don't think is going on anytime soon. Eternal. And what one does, and we've already talked about this at our campus and other places that I've talked about, professors form friendships with one another, form friendships across differences, form friendships primarily with your students.
Right.
So I'm agreeing with you. The only thing I'm adding is that this is a very good kind of presentation for Catholics at what I would call legacy Catholic colleges. So I have no disagreement.
Right.
I just think there's an application that what you're saying, which is those, like the institution is one thing, but you're there, you got colleagues, you agree or disagree with, you got students working the evangelical way with them. I actually think that is where we are 26 years ago.
Yeah.
It's over.
Yeah, I think you and I would agree on this, but I'm not sure. That is, authentic friendship means being able to say, I not only love you and respect you, I enjoy being with you, but I think you're wrong, and I think this is bad, and then brace yourself, for what might come, because no matter how friendly we are, no matter how authentic we engage people, there are going to be individuals and groups that are just simply going to be so self-identified in one set of terms, they're not going to accept friendship. But I think to not be willing to say, I disagree and here's why, but I allow myself to feel the force of what you're saying too, I think the blowback is what's going to make it tempting to betray friendship by no longer saying why we disagree. Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Matthew Cutterback, thank you very much for your talk. Jim's question.
You're part of the same Cutterback clan.
I am.
My oldest is a professor down there now.
Yes, I'm the lesser part, but I am a part.
I doubt that, but proceed.
Don't. Dr. Keating's question sort of helped mine, because what I felt like I was noticing while you were speaking was that there was not very much emphasis on a kind of corporate commitment to Catholicism, the university's corporate commitment to it, but more on the example that professors could give. I'm not saying you were excluding that. I'm just saying you weren't really emphasizing that. And that seemed to be what Dr. Keating pointed out. So that in Ex Corde, which you cite very nicely, what you get there is certain declarations about the way that there ought to be a corporate commitment to Catholicism. So, and this text is very present to me because of recent events, one of the things that he says there is a Catholic university should be ready to proclaim truths that are inconvenient to the culture. It should be ready to evangelize the culture. And so that was not in your talk, and that's not a complaint. It may just be, I appreciated this exchange very much. We don't have that kind of commitment at this college, that kind of corporate commitment, so what do we do to do the new evangelization here? So I just wanted to echo Dr. Keating's question, affirm it. So I guess what I thought to myself was, well, I liked very much your mention of the Eucharist. So I'm not going to so much push back here in my question as try to push forward and ask you to say a little bit more about that. I was thinking to myself as you were speaking, couldn't it happen that in a way the Eucharist is presented at a Catholic college by the Catholic faculty, by the chaplaincy, as in some way the culmination of your education? That the intellect, in fact, is naturally led to prayer and to worship and the will to adoration.
And social justice as an extension of the Eucharist, too.
Sure, but I'm thinking of worship. I mean, I wouldn't exclude that, but that in some ways what we do at a university is we lead the mind and the heart to worship. And in Catholicism, I like what you said about the way that it all comes together there in the Eucharist, in that act of worship. So could I ask, well, let me just fortify my question a little bit more. I thought that you distinguished a little bit too much at the beginning between intellect and will. Not that that's your final position, but just that the way that I heard it.
Distinguish to unite.
But what I would say is even in Ex Corde, John Paul II says that the goal of a university is not veritas, but joy in the truth. So in a way, I don't think that a university has to be described as a place where the truth is pursued. I think that he's got the will already in there, and therefore this whole picture that you're trying to create is already in there. A university is a place where students ought to be led not just to the truth, but to take joy in the truth. And so there it is. There, it's already there. And then in worship and in adoration, right, heart and mind together. So I'm just kind of throwing that out in your direction.
Two key words that you've used, Eucharist and joy. And I would say that the Eucharist, especially in the life of the community, ought to be central, the source and the summit of the Christian life. But as John Paul points out in 3 documents, the Eucharist is also the source and the summit of the new evangelization. But I mean, it starts to sound like religious rhetoric to me unless we unpack it. Blah, blah, blah. It's the source and the summit, all of that kind of thing. I do believe that, we have 3 masses on campus. 6:30, 12:05, and 4:45. More than anything else, I believe it's that experience of worshiping on a daily basis with my colleagues and my students that renews something more than the contract I sign every spring. There really is something profound about this covenant bond that unites us with divine kinship in a way that just captures my imagination, my intellect, but also it fills my will with joy, and I think other people too. The section of the paper that I've cut out, a chapter in the book that I'm outlining, is on the joy of the gospel and how fitting it was for that to be the title. If the joy of the Lord is my strength in Nehemiah 8:10, that ought to be truer in the New Testament than the Old. And I think it's what we ought to instill in our students, that even if they're not going to study theology or philosophy or the history of doctrine, that there's a sense in which, no matter what they're studying within the context of, providence, the thing that how do I say this? You can't get ordinary Catholics, even undergraduates, to the point where they can explain every doctrine or prove it from the scriptures. But what you can get people to do in a community of learning is to enjoy being Catholic. And to me, that's what makes it more contagious than whatever arguments you use, whatever proof text you memorize and deploy. You know, it's the joy that we share, especially because the Eucharist is true. And the Eucharist unites us. And the Eucharist, you know, it's sort of like, you know, all of the hubs converge, or actually all of the spokes converge on the hub of Christ and his presence in the Eucharist. But especially for theology, it's so much more than Radbertus or Retramnus and Berengarius. It really is what we just celebrated. If the Eucharist is not what we claim, then Good Friday was nothing more than a Roman execution. Because it wasn't a sacrifice for any Jew standing there. That can only take place inside the temple on top of an altar, not on some hill outside the walls of the city. But when you look at Good Friday in the light of Holy Thursday, then you realize that the Eucharist that he institutes shows us he wasn't losing his life on Friday if he was giving it on Thursday. That he's not the victim of Roman violence and injustice as much as he's the victim of divine love. I mean, we can think of the tertiapars and the questions that deal with how much love and the divine dignity that makes this so much more to God than what our sins take away. You know, all of these things that we ought to focus on, not just in doctrine, but I mean in the preaching, but also in the conversations. I mean, again, it just bubbles up within me. It's like the Catholic faith is, even after 32 years of entering the church, it's like it's still too good to be true. In fact, it's better than it was when I came in way back then. And it's what creates within me a longing to not only learn it better, but also to learn what other people believe in order to build the bridges to communicate the Mysterium Fidei to them. Because it's like we're constantly reminded that he bled and died for them as much as for Catholics. And that it's not about winning arguments, it's about, you know, drawing those for whom he suffered and died and offers himself in the Eucharist. I think the more we really wrap our minds and our hearts around the joy of Christ in the Eucharist, the more things will fall into place without even, you know. At the same time, I would say this, that if I had been addressing, you know, a gathering of Catholic university and college presidents, you would have heard me accentuate a different syllable. You know, if I was talking just to the board here or anywhere else, or talking just to the Dominican friars who were sort of, you know, the heart of this body that we call PC, it seems to me then that other things would have been brought to bear. But from what I knew about the forum in advance, the little I knew just struck me as being, this would be sort of the pool to dive in and swim around. Yeah.
I definitely agree with you that I have to build that relationship first, but I think nowadays there is a sort of distorted view on that friendship can have that disagreement on some of the most controversial topics or some of the biggest views, and a lot of times invitation to friendship with an acknowledgement of disagreement can sound hateful nowadays, especially with that distorted view of friendship. So how would you say will be a practical way, either between student, professor-student, or administration and group, to be able to build that friendship without saying what you're doing is completely fine, you can do whatever you want to do for the sake of building that friendship?
Well, I mean, if you're going to say that, you're betraying the friendship. I mean, you can't just say, no matter what you think, no matter what you do, you know, it's okay. That's not friendship. But at the same time, if you're just engaging them for the purpose of either setting them straight or having somebody else watch you set them straight so they'll join your side, it's sort of like at cross purposes. I think that's also a betrayal of sorts. I mean, what we saw back in, when was it? Beginning in 79 and going through about 85, when John Paul developed what we now call the theology of the body. I remember before I came into the church, because I came in 86, every week going down to the library at Marquette and photocopying the section of L'Osservatore Romano where he was giving these Wednesday audiences. And I asked my ecclesiology professor if I could do a major study, not the main paper, but halfway through the term, on the theology of the body of Christ, because I was convinced that what he was doing was kind of a breakthrough of sorts, but also applicable to something more than just sexual ethics. And he just sloughed it out. Those are Wednesday audiences. You can't take that kind of thing with any theological seriousness. I forgot about that exchange until I saw him like 10 years later when he came and tracked me down and his Jesuit apologized to me, which is a second-class miracle in itself. But I would say what he did back then is what we need to do now. Instead of simply recycling the theology of the body, as useful and as profound as it is, we've got to really develop new rhetorical and theological, philosophical technologies to communicate in a way that is going to strike the heart and the mind of a millennial. And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to always work, and people are going to disagree. I remember people disagreeing with, what Gustave Martelet wrote or Ghost wrote in Humanae Vitae. Why aren't we not just going back to the bona conjugale and affirming the three goods of marriage and the primary and secondary ends of marriage like natural law? Martelet was bringing in personalism, with the unitive and procreative meanings. Did it convince everybody? It convinced very few people. But now, decades later, we realize that is not just the what of human nature, but the who of persons, and why these are meaningful in a way that, I was converted on this back in seminary long before I even thought that the Catholic Church was anything else but wrong, So I would say what Martelet did for Paul VI, what John Paul did for us. I would say also, to a great extent, what Ratzinger has done in Jesus of Nazareth. That is probably going to be his legacy as much as the theology of the body is, that he's taking Dei Verbum, Article 12 especially, faith and reason, old and new, but scripture and liturgy and life, and just kind of showing that a hermeneutic of faith is scientifically superior, not just spiritually more satisfying. But it's a first attempt. And some guys liked it, others didn't. Schnackenberg obviously didn't. But the things that we have to do are rooted and grounded in love. They arise from a desire to figure out ways to build bridges that won't collapse, that lots of people can cross over on. In my high school, I would have been considered the least likely to convert because of all the time I spent in juvenile court. And I feel like now I have a lifetime to show people that if he can reach me, he can reach anybody, and have a ball doing it. We have the time for one more. Do we have the election?
One more question. And just as a quick reminder before we end, we have our reception just across the hall. I hope all of you will join us afterwards.
Oh, good. I was hoping for a man in white.
Oh, good. Dr. Hahn, thank you. My name is Father Bonaventure, and we're actually alumni from the same institution, Grove City College, both Calvinists who converted to Catholicism. So one of us wearing white, although that's a white shirt.
At the reception, I want to have some time. I want to catch up.
So I'm also, I teach philosophy here, but I'm an assistant chaplain as well. Okay. And I love what you have to say about the Eucharist and the sense of worship, and as the glue, in a sense, source and summit, whatever you want to talk about, the kernel or the core of the Catholic institutional identity. It's beautiful. I also know we both came from a school where, and you are at a school now, where there is a culture of worship. Now in ours, in Grove City, it was mandatory. You had to turn those little chapel cards, and you had to go to Mass, or you had to go to service X amount of times a semester.
We're allowed to go to Mass, yeah. Mass wasn't even allowed to be held on campus.
That's right, yeah. And it is now. When I was there, it was they're back. In any case, how do you, and this is, I think, Dr. Keating's question, Dr. Cuddeback's question, in institutions that are not, say, Grove City, Steubenville, or X, whatever, St. X, how do you get this culture of Eucharist as being this beautiful thing that Father Clark was talking about? Because I offer Mass. I have a 4:30 Wednesday Mass every week, and there are less than 50% of the college community there.
Let's talk about your preaching for one thing.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
It's a little intellectualist, I'll give you that. I did the will thing before. But what are, in a hospital, a Catholic hospital, you could say, in this sense, how do you create the culture for Mass and the worship and the Eucharist is this, other than, You know, and sort of other than a personal invitation, maybe that's the only way. But how do you, as a culture, an institutional thing?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's, you know, I have on my bulletin board a comic strip from Peanuts where, remember the little yellow bird Woodstock? And he has his wings up, and Lucy asks why, and somebody explains how he thinks the sky is falling. You think you can hold up the entire sky with those two little wings, and they walk away just mocking and laughing, you know. And the last is, you know, Woodstock said, one does what one can. You know, that's always been sort of you do what you can. And so whoever comes to the Mass, you know, we have been doing for 28 years, you know, Bible studies in our home. And, you know, it's nice and all of that. But I deliberately do Bible studies in our home so that it starts with the Eucharist, comes back to the Eucharist, even if we're in Haggai or Zephaniah. I'd also say that, you know, when you give people that sort of exposure to truth that is divine, you know, I'm often told that it's like, you know, taking a sip from a fire hydrant, you know, going to one of Hahn's Bible studies. Because I always try to take them to places they don't think they can go. They're not even sure they'd want to. Because I feel like when they see in your eyes the passion, and it's not just enthusiasm, it's a profound sense this truth is why we're here. You know, I'm reminded of Ronald Knox's, you know, he spent almost his whole adult life working on that book, Enthusiasm, because he was just so wary of enthusiasm. And then the conclusion, you know, famously, to paraphrase, is nothing meaningful was ever accomplished by means of enthusiasm. But nothing was ever accomplished without it. You know, and it seems to me that people who are passionate are often not very profound, and the people who are profound are not usually passionate about it. I think the more we can combine head and heart, intellect and will, and especially the joy that comes from discovering truths that are just like, if we could just figure out new ways to get this across to the world, you know, I think God wants to convert our culture more than we want him to. And he's capable of doing more than I have enough faith to ask him to. And so one does what one can, you know, and wherever we are, we do what we're asked, and then we lose ourselves for the sake of others. And in the process, maybe the seeds will grow, maybe the thorns will choke them. But I just, to me, that's sort of why, however much time is left, what I hope to do with the time, you know, and I can sense it's already true for you as well.
Thank you all for joining us, and let's thank our speaker.